Chicago had Capone. New York had Lucky Luciano. But in the mid-50s Florida, the international gateway to the Caribbean is ruled by Santo Traficante, a mob boss turning neighboring Cuba into a gambling paradise.
He was very powerful. He was the go-to guy when it came to Cuba.
He was a mafia don who was smart enough to avoid the limelight.
On the verge of becoming the wealthiest mob boss of them all, he is betrayed by one head of state, then another. Hell-bent on revenge, we know he tried to kill one. But did he succeed in killing the second? Was Santo Traficante behind the terrible assassination that shocked the United States?
Nothing's more sensational than the assassination of the president.
This is the story of Florida's top don, Santo Traficante. November the 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy and his wife are heading for a lunch with civic leaders.
The motorcade begins the 11-mile ride to the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president is to deliver a major address.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the Trade Mart.
The president is hit by 3 bullets in quick succession.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time.
The Dallas police almost immediately identified Lee Harvey Oswald.
They quickly put together a description of Lee Harvey Oswald as a lone nut who may have had communist sympathies and was involved in pro-Castro Cuban operations.
Within 2 hours, the pro-Cuban revolutionary is arrested, case seemingly closed. 2 days later, Oswald is being transferred to the county jail.
You shoot the president? I didn't shoot anybody, no, sir.
A man steps out of the crowd. The gunman is another man with strong links to Cuba, Jack Ruby. One year later, the Warren Report concludes that Oswald acted alone, and his motives were political. Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby, also acted alone.
Just a disgruntled American saddened by Kennedy's death who wanted to take revenge against the accused shooter.
But from the moment it is published, the rushed report comes under intense criticism.
The report was built around the evidence most favorable to that conclusion.
Kennedy's successor, the new president, Johnson, does not want the investigation to drag on.
It was coming up on the re-election, and President Johnson simply did not want the question of what happened to President Kennedy as an issue.
It was obvious to many people it had been done very flimsily. It wasn't a really solid report. There are many questions.
For over a decade, the idea that Oswald was acting alone just didn't sit well. The press report on rumors that Oswald was working for the CIA, that he was working for the Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro, or even the mob. 12 years after the Warren Report, a House Select Committee is formed in another attempt to get to the truth. In September 1978, the committee called a powerful and ruthless mafioso. He was the head of the Florida Mafia and one-time king of Cuba's casinos.
For the record, will the witness please state his full name?
Santo Traficante.
Mr. Traficante, I want to ask you a question that is very important to this committee, and that is, did you have any foreknowledge of the assassination of President Kennedy?
Someone believes that Santo Trafficante knows more about the death of John F. Kennedy than he should. That man is Chief Counsel to the House Select Committee, Robert Blakey. At the very moment the news of the assassination breaks, Blakey is working as a prosecutor in the State Department.
I myself was in the office with Robert Kennedy, the president's brother. All of a sudden, the news of the assassination came out. That somebody would shoot at an American president is unbelievable.
When attorney Blakey first hears the rumors of mob involvement, he doesn't think there is anything in them.
I thought they didn't do it. The killing of Kennedy was not with a machine gun and guys dressed in black.
But when Blakey drafts the famous RICO laws that will eventually put the heads of 5 major crime families behind bars, he goes on a steep learning curve and discovers that the mafia are now a much more sophisticated outfit.
Until the RICO law was passed, mob bosses were virtually immune from prosecution. They never pulled a trigger, they never beat anybody up. The RICO law was able to get them because they were now part of an enterprise.
Now Blakey sets his sights on Trafficante, the one-time Cuban casino king. The first alarm bell is triggered by the death of Oswald.
The killing of Oswald on the way to the jail has all the earmarks of an assassination of the assassin.
Not only is Oswald's murder typical of a mob hit, the man who killed Oswald, Jack Ruby, runs a nightclub used by gangsters linked to a New Orleans mob boss, Carlos Marcello. And Marcello is Trafficante's closest mob ally.
While he's not a member of the mafia, there are connections for organized crime and to the mafia in particular.
And there are other threads in the report that Blakey feels need pulling.
It turned out that it was not as hard-clad as it might be in a conclusion.
The original Warren report glossed over other connections between Oswald and the same Carlos Marcello. Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle and surrogate father is none other than Carlos Marcello's bookmaker. And both Oswald and Ruby have direct connections to Cuba. And somewhere in the middle of this web of intrigue sits the one-time Cuban racketeer, Santo Trafficante.
If you take his connections and trace them out like a concentric circle, it looks like organized crime in some sense were responsible.
So who is this elusive Santo Trafficante?
What is your current occupation?
I'm retired.
This is far from the truth.
By the late 1970s, Trafficante was still considered the boss of the Tampa Mafia and still an influential figure not only in the mob scene in Florida, but nationally.
He had these piercing eyes that could look right through your soul. He could be a ruthless killer. He could turn on you instantly and whack someone and no problem at all.
In 1954, Santo Trafficante inherits the Florida mob from his father.
It's pretty unusual for mafia bosses to hand control over to the sons.
Trafficante Sr. is notorious for eliminating enemies, regardless of profile or reputation. A few years earlier, he was being challenged for supremacy by a gangster called Jimmy Lumia. Trafficante Sr. taught his son what a Trafficante does with those who show no respect. Lumia was a well-known figure in Florida, a close friend of the mayor. Nonetheless, Trafficante Sr. sanctioned the hit. It's a valuable lesson to Trafficante Jr. No matter how high a profile, if someone crosses you, you hit them. Though ruthless, the group Trafficante inherits is little more than a small-time gambling outfit in Tampa. But the young mobster sees an opportunity to expand his operation. A potential gold mine sitting just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. In the early 50s, the Caribbean island of Cuba is run by a brutal and corrupt ex-general called Fulgencio Batista, and Batista throws the doors open to the mafia. Operating completely free of American regulations, mobsters invest heavily in casinos and hotels where they have no trouble with the authorities.
The appeal of Cuba was that it a very corruptible government at that time.
It was a deal with the dictator. They kicked back every night 10% of the earnings from these casinos. It was a tropical paradise.
Could you tell us when you moved to Cuba?
Around 1953 or 1954. I was in the gambling business and the nightclub casino business, which were legal at that time in Cuba.
Trafficante becomes the facilitator for other crime families to move in. Tampa has strong community ties with Cuba, and he is one of the only mobsters to speak the same language.
Trafficante and the Tampa guys, they spoke Spanish, which a lot of the New York mobsters who were operating in Cuba didn't.
Trafficante had the establishment, the connections, he knew the people. It was all set there.
Would you say that collectively, your investment could have been over $1 million?
No.
In fact, Trafficante earns a fortune from his multiple casinos and nightclubs.
He had interest in 5 casinos. He raked in millions all the time.
And it was a booming place for the mafia.
As profitable as the casinos are, they are nothing compared to a new and lucrative market: drugs. Back in the days of Prohibition, most liquor found its way into the United States through Canada. It made the mobs of New York and Chicago very wealthy. Now, drugs are the new commodity, and Cuba the major gateway, right in Trafficante's backyard. Illegal drugs are set to make Trafficante one of the wealthiest dons in the US.
Even if you got the northern mobsters coming down, they were second bananas to the Trafficante family in Cuba.
Within just a few years, the fortune from drugs and gambling ensures the ambitious and cunning Santo Trafficante Jr. has a seat at the mob's top table. November 14th, 1957. A summit is called in Apalachin, New York. The top crime bosses from around the United States are invited, and Santo Trafficante Jr. is now on the list.
Trafficante still wasn't fully on the radar as a big shot, but things were happening that were going to make him an important figure.
Also present is Sam Giancana, boss of the Chicago outfit. The top mob bosses are keen to hear about the leader of the Cuban frontier. But expensive cars with license plates from around the country arouse the curiosity of the local and state law enforcement.
This is the police. You are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and put your hands in the air.
Trafficante escapes jail, but the publicity of the raid shines unprecedented light on the mafia. It confirms the existence of a national crime syndicate, which some had long refused to acknowledge.
Everybody, including FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, said there is no such thing as a national crime syndicate. All of a sudden, all these guys got arrested there by the state police. It was a great shocker and showed the mafia is real.
Top mobster names are sprawled across national newspapers, and the stranger on the verge of mob success is thrown into the limelight.
Suddenly, here was this unknown character in the midst of all dozens of major mob bosses. So it showed you his rank, his stature, and his importance.
Trafficante flees from the attention of law enforcement and the glare of publicity from news reports. It's the last thing he wants, and so he disappears back to Cuba. Within just a few years, Trafficante is making millions importing drugs through Cuba and cleaning the profits through a chain of casinos.
Santo Trafficante was really the major domo and the major figure in gambling in Havana.
But when a young revolutionary communist called Fidel Castro threatens to overthrow General Batista, it puts Trafficante's expanding empire in jeopardy.
Can you tell us, in late 1958, what was the result of the activities of Castro?
Wasn't too good. Every other day they had bombs and stuff like that.
Trafficante cares little for politics, but a lot about profits. So the mob boss moves fast, and like any smart gambler, he covers all the angles.
In the years before the revolution, Castro had come to Tampa, Ybor City, a number of times to do fundraising and speaking events. When he came to town, he would meet with the Trafficantes as well.
In exchange for money, Trafficante secures a deal with the rebel. Even if Castro's revolution succeeds, he has guarantees that it will be business as usual for the mob in Cuba.
Trafficante definitely was hedging his bets. He was paying off the Batista officials and the government, but at the same time, he was giving money to the guerrillas and to Castro.
But by 1958, as the violence escalates, Castro's guerrillas hit profits. Gamblers start deserting the casinos. Other bosses fold and quit Cuba, but Trafficante holds his nerve.
While every other mob figure bolted back to the U.S., he stayed put. He felt secure.
All his buddies, everyone was pulling out. Trafficante felt that he could schmooze his way back in and keep what he had going there.
Whoever wins, Batista or Castro, the Florida mob boss Santo Trafficante believes his empire is safe.
Trafficante had always thought, look, you just buy your way out of anything down here.
On January the 1st, 1959, Castro finally takes control as General Batista flees Cuba. It's only then that the king of Cuba's casinos discovers that he has seriously miscalculated.
He thought he knew the territory. He was wrong.
Castro was a little different fella.
Little did he know that Fidel Castro didn't support anything that they were doing.
Trafficante has been double-crossed.
He waited too long to get out of Cuba.
I got news that the Cuban officials were looking for to put me in jail because one of the things I was a Batista collaborator. They raided my apartment. They were looking for money. They tore up the furniture. They had weapons. I knew that sooner or later I would have to get out of there.
Trafficante soon finds it's not just his criminal empire that's in danger. His life hangs by a thread.
Castro actually jails Trafficante in Triscornia Detention Center.
With men disappearing from the cells around him, Trafficante knows the deal.
You could hear the execution firing squads taking care of Castro's enemies.
They were going to execute him. That's how close it came for him not making it out of Cuba.
Trafficante has to get out, and fast. He reaches out to his long-term ally, New Orleans mob boss, Carlos Marcello.
Mr. Trafficante, do you know Carlos Marcello?
Yes, sir, I know Carlos Marcello about 30 years.
Mysteriously, around the time Trafficante is in jail, Carlos Marcello's bagman, Jack Ruby, makes frequent trips to Cuba.
We know that Jack Ruby made quick trips from Cuba to Miami and back that have no explanation if he was just a tourist.
Could Ruby have been trying to get Trafficante out of jail? The next question gets to the heart of the conspiracy investigation.
Mr. Trafficante, did you ever know a Jack Ruby?
No, sir, I never remember meeting Jack Ruby.
Never remember meeting him?
No.
It seems that Trafficante understands the danger of linking himself to Jack Ruby, the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald.
Trafficante denied it, and denied that he knew Jack Ruby. But there's every reason to disbelieve Trafficante on it.
The committee is desperately trying to join the dots.
Ruby had been connected to Carlos Marcello. He had been running money mainly for Carlos Marcello out of Cuba.
2 months after his arrest by Castro in August 1959, Trafficante is unexpectedly released from jail. Could Ruby have been paying someone off?
He shouldn't have gotten out, period. End of story.
There's little doubt that he got out the very simple way. He bribed his way.
This time, Trafficante doesn't gamble. He leaves Cuba. He's lost everything.
I could see that I had to leave there. There was nothing there for me. Everybody was being arrested and nobody was safe. So I made out I was coming to the States for just a visit, and I never went back.
He was devastated. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
He had multiple millions invested either by himself or through other members of the mob. These were hard dollars, multi-million.
He had more casinos than anybody else. From his point of view, the Cuban Revolution was a disaster.
The gambling empire Trafficante helped to build in Cuba now shifts west to Bugsy Siegel's Las Vegas. Even worse, mob bosses across the United States who had invested in Trafficante's Cuban island haven now want their money back. Trafficante's seat at the mafia top table has been taken from him. And there is only one man to blame for his downfall.
Santo never forgave Castro. One of his biggest aims in life was getting back to Cuba and getting rid of Castro. He would have done anything he could possibly to do it.
But Trafficante isn't the only one with a grudge against Castro.
In Key West, Florida, anti-communist feeling mounts. Fidel Castro is hanged in effigy. Anti-Castro forces are beginning to join hands in other cities.
Santo Trafficante cultivates ties with the anti-Castro exile movement in Florida and surrounds himself with a mob of Cuban gangsters. His involvement doesn't go unnoticed. Trafficante soon discovers that he is aligned with some very powerful allies. September 1960. Trafficante is approached by a messenger sent by the boss of Chicago, Sam Giancana. Giancana wants Trafficante to carry out one of the most high-profile hits in mob history, to kill Castro. But Giancana isn't authorizing the hit. In fact, the contract doesn't come from the mafia at all.
Mr. Trafficante, can you tell us who was the person who first contacted you?
John Rosselli.
John Rosselli is Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana's right-hand man.
Could you tell us the substance of the conversation you had with him?
Well, he told me that the CIA and the United States government wanted this thing done. That is what he said to me.
In the history of organized crime, the lines between the mob and law enforcement are often blurred. But Trafficante's revelation breaks new ground. The American government were asking mob boss Sam Giancana to help assassinate the revolutionary leader of Cuba.
The CIA were desperate to get rid of Castro. He was a persona non grata.
But the CIA is too smart to carry out the assassination itself.
When the U.S. government was looking for somebody to assassinate Castro, they said, well, who are good assassins? They said, the mafia.
It just shows you the respect that law enforcement had for the mafia. They could get things done in a way that law enforcement or legitimate operations could not.
The real scandal is the assumption on the part of the CIA that the mafia was a group of hired killers.
Now the CIA approached Giancana and asked him to find a hitman. Giancana knows when it comes to Cuba, there is only one man with the connections, the king of Cuban casinos, Santo Traficante.
That was just the kind of man the CIA was looking for, a man that belonged to an organization that was skilled in murder and plots and was very unhappy, had lost a lot of money, and would do anything to get back there.
In September 1960, a meeting is arranged at the Fontainebleau Hotel, Miami, between the CIA, Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana, and his chosen hitman, Florida mob boss Santo Traficante. The CIA and the mob are now at the same table with a single sinister aim, an attempt on a world leader's life.
What was your reaction to killing President Castro?
Well, at the time, I think it was a good thing because he had established a communistic base 90 miles from the United States. And being that the United States government wanted this thing done, I go along with it. Same as a war. I figure it was like a war.
Traficante was helping out the CIA because anything that worked to get rid of Castro would be a benefit to him.
The agency first suggests a classic mobster hit in which Castro would die in a hail of bullets.
The government idea was you just send your assassins in and they shoot the fella down.
There is something funny about the CIA trying to tell the mob how to kill someone.
Giancana and Traficante propose a more subtle approach.
Giancana and Traficante, they said, you've got to do this in a clever way. That's when all these poisoning plots were considered.
Was there discussion about poison pills?
There was a discussion about pills, yes, sir. I'm telling you, any kind of a way that was possible to get rid of him.
And Traficante knows an official who can get close to Castro.
Traficante could get Castro to some restaurant where they would slip poison pills into his food.
A plan is agreed, and the CIA officers hand over $150,000 in cash. A line has been crossed. The CIA has just paid the mob to kill Castro.
Traficante knew it was crazy, but he wasn't stupid enough to pass up $150,000. That was tax-free.
But the money and getting revenge on Castro is only part of the deal. In exchange, law enforcement agencies will turn a blind eye to mafia operations.
He was told that if he did this little job for the government, he was home free. Nobody would bother him anymore.
But the plot is soon forgotten as the move against Castro goes to another level. Behind the scenes, Giancana has been helping a charismatic young senator named John F. Kennedy to become president of the United States.
Old man Kennedy, Joe, sent Frank Sinatra, to talk to Giancana. He said, if you carry Illinois for us, there'll be no bothering you. The Kennedys won't go after you.
Joe Kennedy knows that Giancana practically owns this swing state. If anyone can rig votes in Illinois, it's Giancana.
From the mob's point of view, it was a no-lose situation.
And the mob holds up the first part of the deal. They help get John F. Kennedy elected.
Was there mob money in the election in Chicago? Yes. Period. End of story.
Now, with the president apparently on side, Trafficante discovers that the new administration is making Cuba a priority. The CIA are asked to ramp up their plans from an assassination to a full-scale invasion. As a man who has invested heavily in the Cuban exile movement in Florida, Trafficante believes his men will at last get the support they need. On April 16th, 1961, Kennedy sends 1,500 mercenaries, financed by the CIA, to invade Cuba's Bay of Pigs. Among the fighters are some of Trafficante's very own Florida allies, the Cuban exile movement. The plan is that Kennedy's planes are on standby, ready to back the ground forces. The assault is to be a swift surprise attack. But the invaders are outnumbered 10-1. As Castro's forces fight back, Kennedy fails to send American air support. In just 3 days, Castro crushes the American invasion. It is a complete failure.
Well, the CIA plan for the invasion didn't work very well. It was an amateurish campaign that 1,500 or so men could overthrow all of Castro's troops.
Castro is now a national hero, and Trafficante's hope to revive his Cuban empire crumbles. The men he has funded are now dead or in prison. Trafficante has been double-crossed again, first by Castro in Cuba, and now by Kennedy's lack of conviction.
Santo Trafficante only had one culprit, and that was President Kennedy. And he blamed Kennedy more than anybody else for the failure of Bay of Pigs.
And things are about to get a lot worse for the mafia. Giancana had helped Kennedy to get elected, but far from ignoring mob activities, the new president sends his brother, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, to go after organized crime.
There are a number of different areas where action is needed. I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time.
Giancana felt more betrayed.
The fact that he came up with money and helped JFK win went by the board.
Bobby Kennedy, by going after the mafia, incited Trafficante into more hatred.
After first siding with the mob, the American government is now going after them. Twice, Trafficante has been betrayed by Kennedy, and now seeks payback. But the mob in the north is under heavy surveillance, and Trafficante's mob ally, Sam Giancana, is effectively under lockdown.
Giancana was under such intense surveillance that carloads of FBI agents would follow right on his back bumper. Everywhere he went, they went. There was an all-out campaign against Giancana, which made him very angry.
It is impossible for Giancana to have meetings, and completely disrupts the Chicago outfit. Other mob bosses are angry and resentful.
There was no question about the animosity that mob dons had for John F. Kennedy and for Bobby Kennedy.
The conversations about Kennedy were really very vicious.
There were numerous bugs picked up by the FBI. One of them particularly was from Sam Giancana, who said, "We broke our balls trying to get him elected, and look what he does against us, that son of a bitch."
But Trafficante is shrewd and keeps off the phone lines.
He was a mafia don who was smart enough to avoid the limelight. He was never caught on a bug or on a wire, never implicated himself in any crime.
In Chicago, Giancana may be under 24-hour scrutiny, but in the South, Trafficante and Marcello certainly have freedom to plan the mob's revenge on the Kennedys. But did they? The committee had already tried to get to the bottom of mob connections to the assassination of Kennedy. 15 years earlier, in 1975, they called Sam Giancana to testify. But Giancana never makes it to the stand. The night before, he is shot dead. Then, in 1976, they called Giancana's right-hand man, John Rosselli. His first testimony is explosive, and the committee recall him for further questioning. But Rosselli mysteriously disappears. 5 days later, his dismembered body is found inside an oil drum floating in Dumbfounding Bay, Miami.
The three major mafia players the CIA attempt to kill: Castro, Rosselli, Sam Giancana, and Santo Trafficante Jr. And the only one who survived was Santo. The way they were cut up and the way they were shot in their mouths. They were killed in a way that indicated they had been squealers.
Trafficante is the last man standing. But when Blakey looks at the evidence for his connection to Kennedy's assassination, Trafficante was nowhere near Dallas on that November day in 1963. He was with his lawyer in his hometown of Tampa, Florida. November 22nd, 1963, Dallas. Lee Harvey Oswald fires 3 bullets in quick succession. Oswald is a known communist with pro-Castro connections and a grudge against Kennedy. But his uncle and father figure also works for Santo Trafficante's closest ally, Carlos Marcello. Just 2 days later, Oswald is also dead. Killed by Jack Ruby, the man who ran nightclubs for Trafficante's friend. Robert Blakey now believes that there are too many coincidences to be dismissed.
I believe the mob was not involved. I was wrong about that. It did have the motive, opportunity, and means. But killing him, they discussed that.
And somehow, Trafficante fits right at the center. In September 1978, Blakey calls Santo Trafficante to the stand. But will he crack?
Mr. Trafficante, I want to ask you a question that is very important to this committee, and that is, did you have any foreknowledge of the assassination of President Kennedy?
Absolutely not. No way.
Blakey decides to go for broke. He reminds Trafficante of the explosive admission that led to Rosselli's death.
Mr. Trafficante, before he died, Rosselli hinted to associates that he knew who had arranged President Kennedy's murder. It was the same conspirators, he suggested, whom he had recruited earlier to kill Cuban Premier Fidel Castro. Mr. Trafficante, do you have any knowledge of that?
No knowledge whatsoever.
The committee now discover firsthand just how shrewd a mobster Trafficante can be.
Mr. Trafficante, did you ever know a Jack Ruby?
No, sir, I never remember meeting Jack Ruby.
Never remember meeting him?
No.
The House Select Committee keep hitting a brick wall. The silent Don isn't giving anything away.
He always took the same stance. He never knew anything. He didn't remember anybody.
His answers remain consistent.
Absolutely not. No way. No. No knowledge whatsoever.
After 30 months of investigation, 12 volumes of hearings and appendices, the House Select Committee on Assassinations draws to a close. The report is published in 1979 and concludes that while the mafia was not involved, it did not preclude the involvement of certain individuals, Carlos Marcello of New Orleans and Santo Trafficante of Florida.
There was a likely conspiracy And we pointed to the most likely suspects as Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante. But we said we could not indicate it with confidence that they did it.
The only irrefutable conclusion is that Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president and Jack Ruby killed Oswald. Despite Blakey's best efforts, Trafficante walks free. In the following years, Trafficante resumes his activities as the Florida mob boss, and despite Blakey's best efforts, continues to evade the law. Even Blakey's famous RICO law, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which dismantled the 5 crime families of New York, fails to nail Trafficante.
There's no question about how crafty and how successful Santo Trafficante was. He was the only major godfather that Joe Pistone, the special FBI agent, could not get. Santo Trafficante was the only mob boss to escape a big RICO indictment.
But the FBI did not stop looking into the 2 main mafia suspects linked to Kennedy's death. In 1983, fellow suspected conspirator, mob boss Carlos Marcello, is in prison on racketeering and bribery charges. The FBI place an informant in his cell. They talk about the Kennedy assassination, and Marcello opens up.
Marcello said to the informant, "I killed him and I would kill him again."
But before the courts can question Trafficante, his health deteriorates, and in 1987, he dies, age 72. In the years after Trafficante's death, more evidence comes to light. Frank Ragano, long-term lawyer to Trafficante, claims that just 4 days before he died, Trafficante had opened up to him. Trafficante refers to the dead President John F. Kennedy by his mob nickname, Giovanni.
We should never have killed Giovanni. We should have killed Bobby.
He was confessing to the assassination of the President of the United States. My father was just in shock.
A lot of people think if there's a smoking gun, that's it.
But the confessions from Marcello and Trafficante himself come too late for Blakey.
If I had all that evidence in November of '63, I'd have a grand jury and I'd have an indictment. Whether I'd have conviction or not, it's a different story.
It is unlikely that we will ever know whether Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello were the men who hired Oswald and Ruby. But Santo Trafficante was unique. Throughout his life, the quiet Don kept out of the limelight and never spent a single night in an American jail.
Santo Trafficante was the big mafia fish that got away.
And there will always remain the suspicion that Santo Trafficante was the mob boss who pulled off the mafia's greatest hit. In the early days of organized crime in America, one man dominated the headlines.
Alphonse Capone was America's first superstar gangster.
He's said to be responsible for one of the bloodiest hits in mob history. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Al Capone is arguably the only gangster at the time who could murder 7 of his opponents in broad daylight in one of the most audacious hits at that time in gangster history.
But behind the headlines, the true significance of Capone's career is less well known.
He became the face of organized crime in America, and naturally, the federal government had to come in and bring him down.
Capone's swagger set the tone for one of the most glamorous eras in gangland history. But it was Capone's weakness, not his strength, that would teach a group of warring mobs a lesson they would never forget. And set them on course for a transformation into the single, powerful entity we now know as the American Mafia. This is the real story of Al Capone. (1924), Chicago. In the suburb of Cicero, Joseph Klenner, the town's mayor, addresses a crowd of reporters. Behind him stands the man who secured his election, mobster Alphonse Capone.
Al Capone realized that part of the secret to power was to control local governments, which he did by bribing officials. He controlled a local mayor, Joseph Klenner, whom he considered his guy, who was duty-bound to obey his orders.
But Capone isn't happy. The mayor has gone off message and unexpectedly speaks out against illegal speakeasies, which are the foundation of Capone's criminal empire. Capone isn't going to allow such public disrespect.
So he and the mayor were standing on the steps of City Hall, and they had some kind of argument, so Al just whipped out the blackjack.
He literally kicked the mayor down the steps to show publicly this is what happens to people, even politicians, who defy Al Capone.
Other mob bosses would put the mayor straight behind closed doors. But not Al Capone. In this part of Chicago, he fears no one. What kind of man can beat up the mayor directly in front of the cops and get away with it? Capone's rise to power in Chicago begins in the years of Prohibition. In 1919, the US government outlaws the sale of booze. Selling beer or whiskey is now a crime. Cue the arrival of a young New York hood called Al Capone. The young heavy has come to work for gang boss Johnny Torrio. Torrio is building a successful business, bootlegging booze and illegally supplying it to the people of Chicago. Torrio is one of many gangsters across the US turning a fortune by making sure the good times continue to roll. Torrio's illegal speakeasies serve his imported booze to thirsty Chicagoans across the south of the city.
Prohibition was a complete failure in big cities like New York and Chicago. And Chicago already had a reputation for having a corrupt government and a thriving underworld, even before Prohibition.
And Chicago finds itself well placed for this unintended criminal opportunity.
Chicago became the quintessential Prohibition city because of its location. It was close to Canada, just across Lake Michigan. That meant that booze could freely come into the city as an entry point.
Gangsters like Torrio quickly learn that there's big money in turning the smuggling and selling of booze into a slick business. Torrio's Chicago outfit becomes one of the biggest in the city, and the rapid growth means Torrio is always on the lookout for fresh talent. Enter Alphonse Capone, and the young man's ruthlessness and business sharps see him rapidly rise through the ranks.
He quickly identified Al Capone as a promising up-and-comer and a protege, and gradually let Al Capone have more and more responsibility.
But Torrio's success makes him a prime target for rival gangs. One night, Johnny Torrio is ambushed. He is shot repeatedly in the neck and groin. His attacker is one of his underworld business rivals, notorious gangster and bootlegger George Bugs Moran. Bugs aims the gun at Johnny's head, but as Torrio waits for the coup de grace, Bugs' gun misfires. He's out of bullets. Moran leaves Torrio to bleed out. Miraculously, Torrio survives, but the attack affects him deeply.
Johnny Torrio is almost murdered in front of his own apartment, and he decides enough is enough.
Torrio's sure Chicago is no longer safe, so he makes a life-changing decision for him and for Capone.
While Torrio is recovering from his gunshot wounds, he turns everything over to Al Capone, his former protege. And Capone, of course, is delighted by this.
Torrio leaves behind one of the biggest bootlegging syndicates in America and hands the whole Chicago outfit to Al Capone. At only 26 years old, Capone is now one of the youngest mob bosses in America, worth millions of dollars. And he moves quickly to put his own stamp on the Chicago underworld.
Capone is a very ruthless individual, a very violent individual. He came from a very poor background, realized very quickly that, the only way to get to the top was through, violence.
Capone clears the path to profit by bribing police, intimidating politicians, and threatening his rivals. Capone is soon outpacing his contemporaries in the other great prohibition city, New York. Young gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello. In fact, the only mobster who can keep pace with him is one savvy individual, a bright young man who will go on to become one of the most important names in U.S. gangster history, Lucky Luciano.
The two great contemporaries was Al Capone in Chicago and Charles Lucky Luciano in New York.
Lucky Luciano was a rising lieutenant in one of the big New York gangs, but he approaches business in a very different way to Capone.
There was an immense difference between them. Luciano did not look for the spotlight. He wasn't interested in attention. He knew secrecy was his best safeguard.
While Capone's success is built on fear and intimidation, Luciano believes violence inevitably leads to conflict.
His cardinal object was to be no wars between the families.
Attacking your rivals in the streets brought double trouble. Revenge attacks and unwanted police attention. If only the mobs could work together, they could make far more money without attracting the cops.
He wanted no hits and no headlines. If there was bloodshed, the body shouldn't be found. All he wanted was everyone should share the wealth.
But Luciano's way doesn't suit Capone. He doesn't want to work with the others. He just wants Chicago all to himself. And the man who stands between Capone and being king of the Chicago underworld is George Bugs Moran, the mobster who runs the north side of the city.
He thought he had to eliminate the Bugs Moran gang so he could be, if you want to call it, the boss of bosses. No competition in Chicago.
Capone and Moran are heading down the road to a brutal war.
The two of them became rivals for a criminal empire. Only one of them could possibly survive what was essentially a fight to the death.
Capone's gang launch a series of violent attacks on Moran's network.
Gentlemen.
And Moran hits back. Chicago has never seen violence like it. The press go into overdrive, calling the bloody conflict Chicago's beer war. Capone's on the way to becoming America's first ever celebrity gangster. Capone was never going to be an elusive mob boss working in the shadows. He makes the 5-star Metropole Hotel in the center of Chicago his new HQ. Capone takes over an entire floor, with hookers regularly visiting.
The Metropole became a kind of unofficial city hall in Chicago. Everybody knew where they could find him, or somebody who knew him. He was accessible. That was very unusual for a gangster. And he loved to see and be seen wherever he went. And he wore very conspicuous clothes. His suits were kind of an electric blue or electric purple. So he was a peacock, and he loved to show off.
Capone bribes local lawmakers, so he's free to flaunt his position in public without fear of arrest. He wants people to know the face of Al Capone.
Capone loves his notoriety, that he loves being seen as the bad guy. And he sort of plays this up, that, you know, the way he looks, the way he dresses, the way he acts, he's almost like a Hollywood imitation of a gangster in many ways.
He was a huge personality. He would go into a nightclub, he would go into a restaurant, and he would have to sit in the center of the room so that everybody would know that he was there.
But while Capone enjoys the limelight in Chicago, his headlines are causing serious alarm in New York.
Rivals like Lucky Luciano were appalled by this behavior because they felt Capone was just attracting attention to their illicit activities. They wish he would just stop and go away and let them continue without benefit of all this attention.
Luciano and other wannabe bosses aren't interested in showing off. They want to keep their mob business strictly out of sight of the public. Luciano's dislike of publicity comes from his years as a young mobster working for one of the greatest racketeers of his era, a man called Arnold Rothstein.
In New York, Arnold Rothstein was essentially the founder of Organized Crime, Inc. Numero uno, number one, the big man, the big bankroll, the guy who puts everything together.
Luciano had seen how Rothstein had run some of the biggest bootlegging operations in the early years of Prohibition. And he had done it by strictly staying in the shadows. Rothstein had even taught Luciano how to fit into mainstream society, how to present himself as a businessman and not appear to be a gangster showing off. Luciano had learned from Rothstein that for mob business to flourish, it must remain out of the public eye. And as he and other gangsters in New York make their plans in secret to expand the mob, they wish that Capone would just disappear from the headlines. But Chicago isn't going to go away. And Capone's war with Moran is about to spiral out of control. On September the 20th, 1926, Al Capone is eating at a favorite haunt at the Hawthorne Hotel on the outskirts of Chicago. As usual, Capone isn't hiding. He likes to be seen. And his arch-rival, Bugs Moran, has been watching him very closely indeed.
They sent carloads of gunmen out there to blast Capone.
The gunmen open fire indiscriminately. His bodyguard, Frank Rio, flings Capone to the floor to protect him. Thousands of bullets are unleashed in a matter of minutes.
Bullets and glass went flying, and Capone realized how vulnerable he was.
Remarkably, Capone survives. And now he has one thing on his mind: revenge. And the Chicago Beer War is about to make headlines across the US.
Capone's philosophy was kill and then worry about the consequences.
It was a war zone. They didn't use the word terrorism, but gangsters were certainly terrorizing the city, and it was seen as a national crisis.
The war rages on until 1929, when Capone decides to end it once and for all. When Bugs Moran gets an anonymous tip-off to buy a stolen load of Capone's bootlegged whiskey, he thinks it's the perfect opportunity to get the upper hand on his arch-rival. Moran tells his crew they'll do the deal at their secret garage on February the 14th, St. Valentine's Day. Moran's gang wait patiently for the load to arrive. But before the shipment comes in, Bugs' crew get an unexpected visit from the cops. It looks like someone has ratted on the deal. Moran's gang aren't too worried. They can usually buy the cops' silence with a bribe or two. But not these cops. They aren't law enforcers. They're Capone's cold-blooded killers.
He had one of his chief assassins put together a plan to eliminate as many of the Bugs Moran gang members as possible. The assassins pretended to be policemen, had the gangsters line up against the wall, pretending to frisk them.
Moran's men realize too late this isn't a raid, it's a hit.
Capone decided to stage a massacre, but he didn't want to do it himself. He wasn't going to stand there with a machine gun and spatter people with bullets. He was much more likely to hire dangerous gunmen to assassinate somebody than to do it himself.
In a matter of seconds, Moran's squad lie dead on the floor. Photographs of the shocking scene spread across the nation. And the bloodbath is known forever as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. To make sure that no one can pin the killings on him, Capone sits a long way away in the company of an attorney. But he knows that he will be the beneficiary. With Moran out of the way, Chicago is his.
If Moran is dead, Capone realizes he's won, that he has sole control of the rackets in Chicago, and he's the top dog there, and it means that he's immensely wealthy. In today's dollars, he would be a billionaire.
But Moran wasn't among the 7 corpses lying on the garage floor. He never made it to the scene of the shooting. When he saw the cop car outside, he kept driving. Capone's arch-enemy is still alive, and Capone is about to discover that his botched Valentine's Day massacre will add powerful names to his list of enemies. While Capone is publicly battling with Moran for supremacy of Chicago, behind the scenes, up-and-coming mobster Lucky Luciano is plotting to make his own power play for New York. His vision is to end the violent infighting and ease the pressure from law enforcement. It's a revolution in the criminal underworld. With Capone's massacre still fresh in the headlines, Luciano and other New York mobsters plan a conference in Atlantic City.
A lot of what they wanted to talk about at the Atlantic City conference is how do we do this in a matter where not everybody ends up dead? How do we do this in a way that doesn't draw the attention from the authorities?
The obvious move is to get violence off the streets and to run the mob as a professional business. The approach couldn't suit Capone less. So Luciano and the others take the bull by the horns and invite the hot-headed Chicago killer to the Atlantic City conference to sit down and thrash it out.
Other gangsters, either in Chicago or in New York City, they were a little wary of him because they did regard him as a bit of a loose cannon, and they really didn't like his publicity-seeking personality.
Fresh in everyone's mind is the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Capone may love to seek out the limelight, but Luciano and the other mobsters predict severe consequences.
It was very rational for racketeers. As much as people think that they're these big tough guys who are afraid of nothing, they're very afraid of the government. And the last thing they want is to bring down the full force of the United States government on them.
Luciano, with the other gangsters, asks Capone to change his ways. But Capone takes issue with his competitors telling him how to run his business. And he storms out. It soon becomes clear that Capone should have listened to Luciano. Just as Luciano warned, Capone's wild killings soon come to the attention of the most important man in America.
There was a new president, Herbert Hoover, and his first thing was he was confronted by headlines from coast to coast about this massacre and about these outrageous activities in Chicago.
Hoover launches a special task force with one mission: get Capone.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre marked a turning point and the beginning of a concerted federal effort to get Capone, i.e. get him behind bars some way.
Luciano and other gangsters try to put out the public firestorm that Capone has started. They meet with journalists and tell them Capone's Chicago outfit will be disbanded. The story is just a ruse to diffuse the heat. But Capone knows the story is also a message. The other families are running out of patience. With both the US government and the mob on his case, it looks like it's time for Capone to lie low. Capone's next move takes everyone by surprise. He finds safety in the one place no one would expect him to go. He bribes police officers to get him sent to a corrupt jail in Philadelphia, where he finds conditions far from typical.
His stay in the Philadelphia penitentiary was more like a stay in a hotel or a rest cure. People waited on him hand and foot there. Everybody was corrupted, and he had a very easy time there. It was relaxing.
The prison term is in fact part of a deal brokered with Luciano and other mobsters. And Capone is living the high life at the expense of the US government. But back in Chicago, the feds have got different plans for Al Capone. Newsreel across the nation shows elite teams of Prohibition agents aggressively targeting Capone's empire of booze. The squad has been handpicked by the young and handsome Eliot Ness. Nicknamed the Untouchables, it's soon clear that Capone can't buy them off.
The agents who were sent to Chicago to get Capone weren't bribable. They were paid by the federal government, and they had a different allegiance, a different loyalty. They weren't locals, and this made a big difference.
Ness and his squad use wiretaps to find out where the illegal booze is kept, and then raid the warehouses. Ness turns Capone's love of publicity against him. He tips off newspaper reporters who show the world that even Al Capone isn't above the law. Meanwhile, the Treasury Department scrutinized Capone's financial affairs. Back in his Philadelphia cell, the man who craves publicity is getting plenty. But it isn't the kind he's used to. After 10 months behind bars, Big Al gets secretly let out of prison by officials and heads back to Chicago. When he returns, he finds the government have dragged his reputation through the mud. And Al Capone is no longer the king of Chicago. He's now public enemy number one. The obvious move for Capone would be to lie low, but he can't resist publicity. So Capone decides to organize a charm offensive.
He's a publicity hound. He loves, being in the spotlight. He loves seeing his picture in the newspaper. No publicity is bad publicity.
Capone counters the government's campaign and appeals directly to the people of Chicago.
Capone decided to improve his public image by opening a soup kitchen. Many of the working men who were his people were out of work, so he wanted to play the Robin Hood figure. But not only that, he wanted newsreel cameras to come and see him feeding the working people.
Capone says the real crooks weren't hustlers like him, but stock market speculators. But the story is always Al Capone.
Capone was a narcissist to the extent that he had a distorted impression of reality. So he saw himself as the center of almost anything that was going on, and he felt that he was a force for good in the world.
Capone may think he's a good guy, but the US government could hardly disagree more. Working diligently behind the scenes, federal agents have been building a strong case for tax evasion.
Capone was immensely rich. In today's money, he was worth billions, and he didn't pay his taxes.
The police smash open Capone's private safe.
He liked to keep records of what was coming to him to make sure he wasn't being cheated. So finally they had the goods on him.
Facing trial on income tax evasion, Al Capone finds an aroused government ready to put him behind bars.
Capone's indictment hits the headlines. But the charges don't bother Capone. His accountants can strike a deal.
When he found out he was under investigation by federal auditors, he wanted to cop a plea, make a plea bargain, admit that he had not paid taxes for several years.
He offered the United States government $1 million to take care of his back taxes, but they wouldn't take that.
Even when he's brought to trial, Capone is confident that he can walk away. The King of Chicago has a surefire way to beat the rap.
It seemed like he was going to have another brush with the law. He didn't pay his taxes. Who would have expected that he would? And then he would eventually get off scot-free and bribe the jurors if necessary, which is what he did.
At the trial, Capone's men open the checkbooks. They pay off members of the jury. It's a classic mob tactic that has worked before. But not this time. At the last moment, the judge shows that the law is one step ahead.
The authorities realized that he probably would try to bribe the jurors or threaten them in some way so they wouldn't convict him. So they brought in, to everybody's surprise at the last minute, another jury who couldn't have been tampered with.
Capone couldn't be outfought, but he had been outthought. He gets an 11-year conviction for tax evasion.
Nobody got 11 years for income tax violation. That kind of case would have resulted in 18 months or something. But they gave him 11 years.
He was stunned. His lawyers were stunned. Everybody was stunned. It didn't seem possible that one could be jailed for such a, quote, minor offense. Of course, the government wanted to make an example of Capone.
Al Capone, the man who once publicly beat a mayor, now finds himself publicly humiliated by the law. And things will go from bad to worse for Capone, as he discovers that prison life isn't so easy when everyone knows your face. On October 24th, 1931, Al Capone, one of the best-known mobsters in the world, goes to jail for tax evasion.
They didn't get him for any of his gunplay, for any of his murders, for any of his racketeering. They got him on income tax evasion, something he had never anticipated.
Capone's downfall makes the news across the world. It looks like the US government has dealt a mortal blow to organized crime. But in fact, Capone has provided gangsters like Lucky Luciano with a smokescreen. Beyond the glare of publicity, a new, secretive, and highly effective organization of mobsters is taking shape. And they're happy that Capone is locked away.
Other gangsters rejoiced that Capone was now no longer at large. On the other hand, they were afraid that the same thing could happen to them. Gangsters learned to avoid publicity from Capone because they saw where it got him. They realized it made him a target for federal investigations that eventually put him in jail.
Outside, Lucky Luciano will make sure that the negative publicity of gangland violence will never again damage their business. When Luciano makes his play for control of the New York mob, he does it not by ordering a public massacre, but with just 2 strategic hits. First, he sacrifices his own godfather, Joe Masseria. And next, Masseria's arch-rival, Salvatore Barazzano. Luciano is now the most powerful mobster in New York. Soon he will lead the Commission, the mob's board of directors, and usher in a new era of cooperation and wealth for what will become the American Mafia. Where Capone failed in his Valentine's Day massacre, Lucky Luciano takes everything with just 2 deaths. Behind bars, his empire gone, Capone's reputation is in tatters. Now the government decide to use Capone for some publicity of their own. They move America's most high-profile gangster to the New Island fortress of Alcatraz.
President Hoover said to the warden, "If you want the world to know what a horrible place Alcatraz is, transfer Al Capone out there." And that is exactly what they did. He was in a 6-foot by 10-foot cell. And they put him on the outside where he could look across the bay at San Francisco. For people to come to visit him, they had to get on a ferry boat and go across the water.
No longer the feared man he once was. For the first time in his life, Capone tries to keep a low profile.
When Al Capone was in Alcatraz, it was humiliating in part because other prisoners were not afraid of him. He was given a very derogatory term, the wop with the mop, because he was often seen mopping.
Capone learns that his reputation is now a magnet for criminals wanting to make a name. One is Jimmy Lucas, a member of a gang called the Texas Cowboys. Capone's fall from grace is complete. His life in the spotlight is bearing bitter harvest. In time, prison doctors discover that perhaps Capone wasn't entirely to blame for his reckless behavior.
Al Capone suffered from syphilis. He acquired it from prostitutes as a young man in Brooklyn, didn't realize that he had it, and it explains a lot about his behavior and his temperamental outbursts throughout his life. As he got older, it also shattered his health because there was no cure for it at the time.
In 1939, Capone is released from prison on medical advice. By now, the syphilis had spread to his brain, and Al Capone has the mental age of a 12-year-old.
The family had a big party for him in Chicago when he got released. And my mother said that Al was there, but he would come up to her and say, "Who are you?" And then he would go over to his own sister and say, "Who are you?"
Al Capone will live out the rest of his life in seclusion in his mansion in Florida. A gangster without a gang. On January the 18th, 1947, shortly after celebrating his 48th birthday, Al Capone suffers a massive stroke and slips into a coma. At almost the exact same time, some of the biggest mob bosses in the US meet in Havana, Cuba. They plan the future of the mob. A future without Al Capone. Instead, it will be led by Lucky Luciano.
He wanted the American mafia to be a mirror of American capitalism, to cash in on anything that worked with capitalism. And he wasn't going to be restricted. This was a new era, and he was going to modernize the mob. And that is exactly what he did.
A few days after his stroke, Capone dies. The era of celebrity mobster is over, and a new generation of gangsters is born. Now mobsters will work together to create a secret society that dominate crime for generations. They call it Our Thing, La Cosa Nostra. The world will know it by another name, the American Mafia. The foundations for this organization were laid by Al Capone. But his contribution wasn't through inspiration. It was his brutal and public mistakes that had taught the mob how not to behave. His career may have ended in disaster, but to this day, Al Capone defiantly remains the most famous name in mob history. Public enemy number one.